In 1826, a man who had liberated 6 nations stood before the Congress of Panama and proposed something that terrified every banker in London. His name was Simon Bolivar. He was the most successful revolutionary in the Western Hemisphere. He had freed Venezuela, Colombia, Ecuador, Peru, Bolivia, and Panama from 3 centuries of Spanish rule, and now he wanted to unite them, all of them, into a single Latin American superpower. One continent, one federation, one voice. If Bolivar had succeeded, Latin America would have become the largest republic on earth, larger than the United States, richer in natural resources than any European empire, and completely independent of the London banks that had just spent 5 years lending money to each of these new nations, separately, deliberately, and on terms designed to keep them weak. 5 London banking houses controlled the Latin American debt market. They had lent to Colombia separately, to Peru separately, to Chile, Argentina, Mexico, each one separately, never together, never as a bloc. Because a united Latin America would have negotiated from strength. 20 separate indebted nations negotiated from desperation. Bolivar understood this. He wrote about it. He warned his generals about it, and he tried to stop it. He failed. And the debt architecture that defeated him is still visible in the borders of South America today. This is that documented story. Before we go further, drop where you are watching from in the comments right now. I want to know which countries are following this money trail. And stay to the end, because the words in this video come directly from Bolivar's own letters, London banking records, and the documented proceedings of the Congress of Panama. Between 1810 and 1825, the Spanish Empire lost almost every colony it had in the Americas. Revolutions swept from Mexico to Argentina. 300 years of colonial rule ended in 15 years of war. The revolutions were fought with borrowed money, and the lenders were British. From the very beginning of the independence wars, Bolivar and the other revolutionary leaders needed weapons, ships, and soldiers. Spain still had a navy. Spain still had garrisons across the continent. The revolutions could not succeed without foreign arms, and foreign arms required foreign credit. London was the only place on earth with enough capital and enough appetite for risk to finance a continent of revolutions. And London's bankers saw an opportunity that would define the next 2 centuries. 5 banking houses dominated the market. Baring Brothers, the most powerful merchant bank in the world, run by Alexander Baring, the man who had personally financed the Louisiana Purchase for the United States. Rothschild, who took the higher quality borrowers like Brazil. Goldschmidt, who handled the riskier loans to Mexico and Colombia. Powles and Graham. And Barclays. These were not charitable institutions. They were commercial lenders who charged commissions and interest and expected repayment enforced by the full weight of international finance. They lent to each new republic individually. Colombia received its first loan in 1822, £1.5 million British pounds through Powles and Graham. A second loan followed in 1824 through Goldschmidt for £4.75 million. Peru borrowed. Chile borrowed. Buenos Aires borrowed £1 million through Baring Brothers in 1824, the first foreign loan ever issued to a newly independent South American nation. Mexico borrowed. Each one negotiated a loan against the most experienced financial institutions on earth. The terms were devastating. Interest rates were excessive. Commissions were abusive. And the securities were sold on the London Stock Exchange at prices far below their face value, meaning the new republics owed the full amount but received only a fraction of it. Bolivar himself described what was happening. In a letter to his general Antonio Sucre in May 1823, he wrote that Britain desired to form a league with all the free nations in order to put herself at the head of these peoples and rule the world. He wrote that Britain preferred Latin American nations to be independent, albeit weak, and with a fragile government. Independent, but weak, and in debt. The bulk of the money borrowed never reached Latin America. The London bankers skimmed enormous commissions at the source. Large portions were spent purchasing weapons and military equipment from British merchants, at prices set by the same British financial system that had arranged the loans. What eventually arrived in South America was a fraction of what was owed, and the new republics were liable for the full amount. Bolivar watched it happen. He wrote about it with increasing despair. In one letter, he described the debt as a chain more powerful than the chains of Spain. In another, he warned that the new republics were trading one master for another, the Spanish crown for the London counting house. By 1826, the year Bolivar convened the Congress of Panama, every newly independent Latin American nation was already in debt to London. Colombia had already defaulted on its loans. Peru was in default. Mexico was in default. Chile was in default. Between 1820 and 1914, 75% of all sovereign defaults in the world involved Latin American countries. The The pattern was established before the revolutions were even finished. The independence was real. The freedom was conditional. And the condition was debt. Bolivar saw the trap. He understood that 20 weak, indebted nations would never be free as long as they negotiated a loan against the same 5 banks in London. His solution was unity. And what happened at the Congress of Panama in 1826 reveals exactly who wanted that unity to fail and why. In 1826, Bolivar convened the Congress of Panama. The goal was extraordinary, a permanent confederation of Latin American republics with a shared military, coordinated foreign policy, and collective economic power. If the Congress had succeeded, it would have created the largest federation in the Western Hemisphere. A unified Latin America would have controlled more territory than the United States, more natural resources than any European power, and enough collective economic weight to renegotiate every loan on the continent from a position of strength. That is precisely why it failed. Only 4 nations sent delegates: Gran Colombia, Peru, Mexico, and the Central American Federation. Argentina did not attend. Chile did not attend. Brazil, which had borrowed through Rothschild on better terms than its neighbors, did not attend. Bolivia did not attend despite being named after Bolivar himself. The United States sent a delegate who died on the way. Britain sent an observer, not to participate but to watch, and to ensure the outcome served British interests. The British observer was Edward Dawkins. His instructions from Foreign Secretary George Canning were explicit. Canning had written that Britain's policy was to ensure that Latin America remained divided into separate states, each one commercially dependent on Britain. A unified bloc would have the power to set its own terms. Separate nations could be played against each other. Canning's strategy was not secret. He stated it openly in the House of Commons. Canning stated publicly that he had called the New World into existence to redress the balance of the Old. What he meant was that Britain had supported Latin American independence not because it believed in freedom, but because independent weak republics were better customers than Spanish colonies. A Spanish colony traded only with Spain. An independent republic could be forced to trade with Britain as a condition of the loans that funded its independence. The Monroe Doctrine, declared by the United States in 1823, warned European powers to stay out of the Western Hemisphere. It is taught in American classrooms as a defense of Latin American freedom. But at the time, it served British interests more than American ones. The doctrine kept France and Spain from reclaiming their colonies, which meant that Britain's commercial monopoly over the new republics remained unchallenged. The European bankers who held Latin American debts were threatening to use those debts as justification for military intervention and recolonization. The Monroe Doctrine blocked that path, but it did not block the financial path. The loans remained, the debts remained, and London remained the only source of credit. The Congress produced a Treaty of Confederation. It was signed by the delegates present, and then it was sent back to each nation for ratification. Not a single nation ratified it, not one. The reasons were local: political rivalries, territorial disputes, distrust between generals who had fought alongside each other only years before. But underneath all of it was the financial reality. Each nation was individually indebted to London. Each nation's debt was secured against its own national resources. A confederation would have required merging those debts, and the London banks that held them had no interest in allowing their separate collateral claims to be consolidated into a single negotiation. A united debtor is dangerous. 20 separate debtors are manageable. Bolivar understood this with devastating clarity. He wrote, "The United States appears destined by Providence to plague America with misery in the name of liberty." But it was not the United States that defeated his Congress. It was the City of London. Subscribe if this is your kind of history. In December 1825, just months before Bolivar's Congress convened, the London Stock Exchange crashed. The speculative bubble that had fueled the Latin American lending boom burst. Hundreds of British banks failed. Goldschmidt, the firm that had handled Colombia's and Mexico's loans, went bankrupt. The flow of credit to Latin America stopped overnight. The new republics had been borrowing to survive. Their governments ran on foreign credit. Their armies were paid with foreign loans. Their infrastructure was built with British capital. When the credit stopped, the governments could not function. Every Latin American borrower except Brazil defaulted between 1826 and 1828. Brazil survived because it had borrowed through Rothschild on more favorable terms, and because Rothschild had selected Brazil precisely because it was the most likely to repay. The other banking houses, Goldschmidt, Powles, had taken the riskier borrowers and charged them higher rates. When the crash came, the riskier borrowers defaulted first, and the banks that had charged the most abusive terms collected the least. The defaults triggered a chain reaction. London banks refused to lend again to any Latin American government. The new republics could not service their existing debts, interest accumulated, penalties mounted, and the original loans, which had delivered only a fraction of their face value to Latin America, now grew into obligations that would take decades to resolve. Some of these defaults lasted 30 years. Colombia defaulted 5 times between 1826 and 1900. The cycle of borrowing, default, restructuring, and borrowing again became the defining pattern of Latin American finance for the next century. The default cemented the power dynamic that Bolivar had tried to break. Each nation now negotiated its restructuring individually with its London creditors. Each nation was forced to pledge additional national resources as collateral, mining rights, customs revenues, export taxes. Each nation signed trade agreements that gave British merchants preferential access to local markets. The free trade that Britain demanded as a condition of lending destroyed local manufacturing, because Latin American producers could not compete with British industrial goods. The debt that was supposed to fund liberation became the instrument of a new dependency, financial rather than colonial, but equally binding. Bolivar watched his dream collapse. Gran Colombia, the federation he had built from Venezuela, Colombia, Ecuador, and Panama, fractured into separate nations in 1830. The generals who had fought beside him turned against him. The politicians who had followed him now blamed him for the debts he had been forced to take on to win their freedom. He was accused of dictatorship by the very men whose nations he had created. The man who had liberated the continent died in December 1830, alone, impoverished, and betrayed by the very nations he had freed. He was living in a borrowed house near the Colombian coast. He had no money. He had no army. He had no country that would claim him. His last words reflected his despair. He said, "All who serve the revolution have plowed the sea." He was 47 years old. He owned nothing. The bankers who had lent to his revolution owned everything. And the debt trap did not end with Bolivar's death. It deepened. Over the next 60 years, Baring Brothers became the dominant banker to Argentina, channeling 140 million pounds of British investment into the country between 1885 and 1890 alone. Argentina became the most indebted nation in Latin America. Its economy ran on British credit. Its railways were British-owned. Its exports flowed through British shipping lines. It was the model of what London wanted every Latin American nation to become, formally independent and financially captive. In 1890, the system collapsed again. Argentina could not service its debts. Baring Brothers, sitting on 8.3 million pounds of toxic Argentine securities it could not sell, went bankrupt. The Bank of England had to assemble an emergency rescue fund with Rothschild and every major London bank to prevent the entire British financial system from collapsing. Nathan Rothschild warned that without the rescue, the whole private banking system of London would have fallen. London saved itself. It did not save Argentina. Argentina's GDP fell 11%. Its national bank was gutted to pay British creditors first. The crisis spread across every Latin American economy. By the 1890s, Latin American nations held nearly 60% of the world's defaulted debt. The same pattern, the same banks, the same result. 65 years after Bolivar warned that debt was a chain more powerful than Spain, the chain was still tightening. The 5 London banking houses had lent to a continent of revolutions. They had collected commissions on every loan. They had sold weapons at inflated prices through their own merchant networks. They had ensured that each nation borrowed alone so that each nation would stand alone. And when the credit collapsed, they held separate claims against separate nations that could never unite to challenge them. The borders of Latin America today, 20 separate nations where there could have been one, are not the product of geography or culture or language. They are the product of a debt architecture designed in London in the 1820s by 5 banking houses that understood one simple truth. A divided continent is a profitable continent. What makes this story different from a theory is that the primary sources are preserved. Bolivar's letters, including his warning to Sucre about British intentions and his description of debt as a chain more powerful than Spain, are published and archived. The correspondence is available in multiple collections, including the selected writings of Bolivar. The London banking records documenting the loan terms, the commissions, the discount prices, the actual amounts delivered versus the amounts owed, are preserved in the archives of Baring Brothers and in the records of the London Stock Exchange. George Canning's instructions to Edward Dawkins, the British observer at the Congress of Panama, are in the Foreign Office archives. His public statement about calling the New World into existence to redress the balance of the old is published in parliamentary records. The proceedings of the Congress of Panama, the treaty that was signed and never ratified, are in the diplomatic archives of Colombia. The default records, showing that every Latin American borrower except Brazil defaulted between 1826 and 1828, are documented in the financial histories of the period and in the records of the London Stock Exchange. The subsequent debt restructurings, each one negotiated individually, each one extracting additional concessions, are preserved in the archives of the creditor banks and in the Foreign Office records of Britain. Between 1820 and 1914, 75% of all sovereign defaults in the world involved Latin American countries. That statistic is not a coincidence. It is the mathematical consequence of a lending system designed to keep an entire continent divided and in debt. Simon Bolivar liberated 6 nations. He tried to unite them into one. 5 London banking houses made sure that never happened. By lending to each nation separately on terms that guaranteed dependency. By ensuring the Congress of Panama had no financial foundation to stand on. And by holding separate debt claims that made unity economically impossible. He died at 47. Warning that all who served the revolution had plowed the sea. 200 years later, the borders he tried to erase are still on the map. And the debt architecture that drew them has never been taught in a single classroom. That is not a theory. That is a paper trail. If this connected something you were never taught in any classroom, that is exactly what this channel exists to do. Every video on this channel follows the money through the primary source archive. Subscribe if you follow the paper trail. And if you made it this far, leave the word Bolivar in the comments so I know who stayed for the full story.